I shall try to analyze what I think is a crisis leading to war and conflicts, crisis of modernity in its both forms, capitalist and socialist, and continuing crisis of unadapted to nowadays situation traditional conservative religious behaviors in a world discovering spirituality linked with social questions. After the Second World War, big powers accepted the Charter of the United Nations and consequently the principles of general disarmament, collective security, and non-intervention in the internal affairs of each sovereign state. Even if these new fundamentally egalitarian and non-colonial goals could not be fully realized, a tremendous diplomatic work was launched with important results on the legal ground, so the danger of war seemed to be constantly diminishing in most regions of the world from the beginning of the so-called Cold War up to the time of the peaceful coexistence, détente, and Helsinki Treaty. But now humankind is witnessing back unending series of uncontrolled wars, piracies, and foreign interventions in different parts of the world, mainly in the so-called Great Middle East, and also in eastern Congo and surrounding countries, which have been the theater of the most bloody and kept silent conflict since 1945. This evolution seems to be the consequences of various factors. The end of the post-Second World War balance of power, the crisis of the dominant economical system, the disintegration of the traditional values at the very same time with the crisis of modernity and especially the crisis of leftist ideologies produced by the Enlightenment ideas. Simultaneously, we are witnessing very different forms of religious and spiritual rebirth and the development of new forms of social activities taking into account ethical and ecological questions. This situation may open the road to new perspectives for a peaceful future. Under certain conditions, we have to take this time into account. The post-Second World War order was based on several fundamental conditions: the emergence of two non-traditionally colonial superpowers, the anti-fascist mobilization of most of world masses, and the beginning of the process of decolonization. All this led to the Charter of the United Nations and to the Bandung Declaration, which paved the way for an officially more or less accepted world consensus on basic internationally recognized principles and values. At the same moment, we could observe a general economical development and the promotion of social mobility simultaneously, at least officially, with the acceptation of the principle of social progress, both inside each country, like on world level as a whole, and between nations, each formally at least recognized as equal to others. But the end of the bipolar world changed the situation and led to growing inequalities and simultaneously to the awakening of the non-aligned countries movement. The balance of powers was replaced by the tendency to promote a unipolar world, and this led both to massive illusions and to massive disequilibrium in the international relations. What seems, with the hindsight distance we have now, to have been something like a check and balance system at the world level at the time of the Cold War was replaced by a system of no mutual control, self-expansion, and ethnocentric vision of the world. One ideology, one political culture, one social and economical structure, and one civilization was supposed to represent the so-called universal values. It was the time of the so-called end of history. This illusion did not last long, but no new balance of power did appear since the big disillusion that came just after. It appears now, with the historical perspective we have, that the crisis of the so-called socialism, first in its communist and then its in social democratic version, Keynesianist in Western country, and so-called non-capitalist way of development in many of the non-aligned third world countries, paved the way to the crisis of modernity as a whole, and consequently to the current global crisis of the whole capitalist system. What we are experiencing now is then not only an economical or a social crisis, but a major civilization crisis. In fact, it appears now that the so-called real socialism, but also social democratic reformism and non-aligned movement, did not manage to create a real, complete and holistic alternative to the old dominant system, which contradiction had been on the other side quite well analyzed at the time of their strength. This explains why the impression prevailed after 1989 that humankind is unable to create an alternative to the Western capitalist civilization. This situation of incompletely built alternative to the worldwide dominant system explains then logically why the crisis of the modern Western system began most apparently in what was in fact rather a periphery and just to a certain extent a critical part of the dominant order and ideology. Since this incomplete alternative, the real socialist, the social democratic and the non-aligned one, was situated at the periphery of the dominant system, it is then logically there that the disintegration process of modernity begins there, so to reach at the end the very core of the system, the Western world, what we are experiencing now. What we are experiencing now is non-ending wars and intervention of NATO outside its borders and fundamental financial crisis on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean with massive popular protests, is a system which does not appear anymore for at least very large parts of humanity as a democratic one, but as an oligarchistic dictatorship for the majority, somehow democratic for the rich and privileged ones. In reality, the crisis of real socialism and non-aligned movements did not signify that the existing problems linked with capitalism and Western civilization and denounced from the very beginning by socialists ceased to exist. It appears rather that class contradictions, social and regional inequalities, imperialism, did not disappear during the 20th century up till now. On the contrary, we can observe that the causes that created the attempt to imagine a socialist alternative to the global and colonial capitalism, to the imperialism, has not been bypassed during the day of the Cold Wars. And the problem of war and peace for the conquest of new markets in the form we observed before 1914 or 1917 reappeared. But in the same time, we can notice that some of the aspects, at least of the whole modern conception, especially its tendency to deny religious and spiritual questions, appears to be at this stage fundamentally irrelevant. The crisis of Marxism and other alternative ideologies led naturally first to the logical reappearance of neo-idealistic and traditionalistic trends, such as neo-tribalism, neo-fundamentalism, and so on. We have been witnessing the coming back of old form of human conscience in a more acceptable form. In the same time, we did observe the rebirth of much more authentic religious feelings worldwide. Simultaneously, most of the observed religious rebirth movement, both in the Islamic world, even if to a lesser extent also in traditionally Christian countries in other parts of the world, but also in India, for example, did not pave, for the moment at least, fundamentally the way for a better world. Except maybe to a certain extent for Latin America, where the political, economical, and social situation seems to improve, and where civil wars and violence diminished under the influence of more or less radical regimes influenced partly by the Christian liberation theology. We are now, in fact, in front of a three-dimensional ideological crisis. Crisis of the Western capitalist system, crisis of the socialist alternative system, and crisis of the conservative and traditional religious systems, We have then to reflect about the causes of the crisis of capitalism and Western civilization at the very same time when modernistic alternative ideas and traditional religious beliefs do not seem, in their presenting existing forms, sufficiently rebuilt to allow humankind to get out from the burden we are living now. We have to recognize the fact that capitalism is a rather spontaneously creative, dynamic process which created a lot of progress but tends to ignore the social results and the spiritual goals most human beings need to live with. Socialism is supposed to be a rationalistic and planified process solving social problems and contradictions based on the consideration of the interest of the people. And undoubtedly, under all types of socialism, social and cultural condition of the masses did improve. But in its real process up till now, socialism tended to ignore the needs of spontaneity and autonomy of the human being, and also to accept questions about the ultimate goals of life and the fundamental reason why humans should really show good social behaviors. Ethical questions were neglected from the very beginning by Enlightenment ideas, based on the presupposition that a rationally behaving man should automatically behave according to the global social interest. Religions, in their real, concrete, and traditional structurations, were tending to make human beings better for the ultimate goal of the creation, but they forgave most of the time to manage with the necessity of scientific progress and concrete social progress here and now. Class questions for the deprived ones on one side and for the privileged ones on the other can explain the contradiction that break the progress of societies under the influence of too conservatively oriented religious trends. We believe that the incomplete realization of the potential existing in each of existing religions, ideological and mental system constitutes one of the main causes of human conflict nowadays. Truths only partially taken into account constitute the core of reductionist visions of all the potentials contained in the human beings. This led consequently up till now to an unknown degree of the tendency for the rate of profit to fall, pushing capitalism inevitably toward a situation of permanent crisis. Materialism was once a natural, logical, and to a certain extent positive reaction to the domination of a traditionally mostly European form of spirituality, ignoring most of the material base and interest of human beings. But materialism was then consequently one-sided and tended to ignore the spiritual and needs and potentials to get an answer concerning the long-term goals of human life and creation. That's why we are now experiencing the triple crisis I talked about. Religious rebirth seems still to exist mostly as a reaction against crisis of the most arrogant and reductionist forms of the radical, rationalistic and secularized ideologies, but it still did not produce a new holistic vision corresponding to the needs of our times, where are both material and spiritual, social and individual, national and international, taking into account the present rhythm and possible deviations of progress. Even if the degree can vary between country and religions, everywhere in the planet, we can observe that spirituality and religious trends are still confronted and endangered with secularized behaviors and ideas, especially consumerist ones. We can then conclude that humankind is not ready to resign from social and economical progress, even if religions are giving answer to fundamental human needs often ignored by secularized ideologies. This situation makes most probably the reappearance of a new form of holistic vision inevitable, a holistic vision more or less consciously contained in all religions and ideologies, even if sometimes promoted by humans in a reductionist way. A holistic vision that needs now to take into account both material and spiritual, social, individual problems of the human being in a more, let's say, dialectical and in a less analytical and mutually exclusive way. We need to find answers to the growing social and regional gap. We need to find answers to irrational waste carried on by the consumerist society of lust. We also need to find answers to the ultimate goals of the existence of life. We need then to experience a form of link between social interest and ultimate goals of our lives. The experience of the two last centuries shows us that human beings need to believe in something which makes sense, both immediately and internally. The reason of the crisis of religion which appeared in Europe at the time of Enlightenment and the reasons of the crisis of Enlightenment itself now have reached a common point. The present economical crisis has different causes, but the financial speculation seems to be one of the main causes of this permanent unrest and wars the empire is carrying on since the end of the Cold War. Marxists analyzed quite objectively the cause of war. In the same time, modern human hesitates to condemn with religious and traditional terms what characterizes the present economical financial system, usure, rate of interest credits. What we can denounce on this aspect is then not some radicalism of religions, but on the contrary, their great shyness to confront now with the very fundamental reason of violence, inequality, and despair. In the same time, we should criticize the fact that most of the contemporary radicals refuse to establish a link between economical laws and more traditional critics about human greed leading to expansion and conflict. In Europe, most Christians and Jews resigned from the idea to build a social order, eliminating usure, and this paved the way to capitalism, and later, as a logical reaction to its incompleteness, to socialism. But usure paved also the way to a mass society where despair began also to be massive. This system expanded during colonial times to the rest of the world. But Islam, contrary to other post-Abrahamic religions, did not cease, at least formally, up till now, to condemn fundamentally the principle of usure. This, in common with other factors like anti-colonialism and basically much more positive attitude toward rational analysis, tends to explain why Islam is now the religion which is still developing and confronted to a lesser crisis than others. But whoever observes Islamic society cannot neglect also the fact that they are also facing nowadays a situation of profound crisis, not only due to the legacy of colonialism. Islam as such did not accept colonialism, it did not accept principle of human equality, did not accept usure, but real existing Muslim society and leaders accepted very often to conclude compromises between their principle and the dominant ideology.